talk about what is a molecular whiskey.
Nick Drinks.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Nick Drinks. I'm your host, Nick Britsky, and we have a special guest. They're all special. We have a special guest here all the way from San Francisco. This is Alec Lee. He is the co-founder of Endless West, and they are the makers of the first ever molecular whiskey, Glyph. Hello.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So what is the connection to Michigan? Because you're not launched in a ton of states yet, is that correct?
That's right. So this is actually our third market in the U.S. I mean, we just launched 6 months ago, so it's very, very fresh.
Yes, Michigan.
But I actually grew up in this area.
Oh, fantastic.
So it helps that this still feels like home for me. And it was a really interesting sort of market. I think there's a lot of really progressive, interesting things that are cropping up in Detroit. And hopefully that resonates with what we're doing as a very different kind of way of thinking about whiskey.
Yeah, so different. Talk about what is a molecular whiskey.
Yeah, so there's like a very short answer to that, and there's a much longer, drawn-out answer to that. The 5-second version is we think of it as like electronic music for whiskey. You know, there's a traditional way of thinking about how music is made with woodwinds and pianos and cellos, and someone comes along and one day says, you know, there's these elements of what make music great that I can theoretically make on a design on a computer. And I still need to know the core elements of what is music in order to be able to design on a computer, but I'm fundamentally reinventing the medium by which I express that music. And so the same kind of thing is happening with us. There's a huge technology element that goes in the back end. We want to understand what makes whiskey at the molecular level. And the basic thesis is the molecules that you find in whiskey or wine or really any other beverage or food, you can find them in a bunch of other places in nature too. There really isn't anything that's unique to whiskey. Whiskey is a unique combination of those things, but not a unique presence of any of those molecules.
Okay. And are you trying to compete with whiskey or be something different?
It's an interesting way of framing the question. You know, we get asked a lot, like, why are you bothering to do this? Or, you know, what's wrong with traditional whiskey? And I don't think that's the right way to frame it. In the same way, to come back to the music analogy, electronic music doesn't have to exist in the absence of the existence of other forms of music. Okay. It's just another way of expressing the art. And so for us, you know, molecular whiskey exists to be a novel expression that people will hopefully add to their repertoire and, you know, sometimes be in the mood to hear a different story, right? To watch a different movie, to listen to a different genre of music.
Okay. And why Glyph? Why'd you call it Glyph?
Yeah, so the name is really interesting. For us, it's like glyph as in like symbol or hieroglyph. So the idea is that every one of those molecules that we have to source and then combine, each one adds its own unique character to the experience of that product. And so there's some idea of glyph as the representation of the molecules, the symbols that come together and tell the story of whiskey.
Okay, great. Well, let's try a little bit.
Let's do it.
So talk about what should we be kind of smelling when we try this.
So it has the very early days of this was sherry cask influenced.
Okay.
And so it's definitely going to be a lot more caramel, vanilla, sweeter notes. But it quickly diverged from that. So what we don't want is to people to drink and expect, oh, I'm going to be drinking like something analogous to Macallan. It quickly diverged because we realized, you know, we have this blank canvas and we can paint whatever we want onto it. We do ultimately have to make human choices about what goes onto that canvas. And we're really also inspired by a lot of the crisper notes, the refinement of Japanese whiskeys, even some of the sweeter, fruitier kind of notes of Canadian whiskeys. And so you're going to get a lot of those things. You're not going to get a lot of peat. You're not going to get sort of like bold, smoky notes. And we also wanted to have something that was really approachable and that would mix well. And so you're going to get a lot of sort of more lighter bodied, not overpowering kind of notes on that.
So one of the comparisons I draw is, I think it was Shackleton that they found the whiskey kind of on an expedition, and then they kind of made their own blend. So because they only had a couple bottles, they made their own blend so they could sell it. Is that kind of a similar approach that you kind of tasted things and picked up flavors that you wanted to then recreate? Or kind of how did you pick the palette that you painted with?
Yeah, so we end up having to scan hundreds of bottles of the market.
Okay.
So if you imagine...
So whiskeys, bourbons, rye, scotch,
absolutely,
everything? Okay.
All across the board. if you imagine that, you have a blank canvas and you want to paint a tree, it helps to kind of have seen a tree before and potentially even seen multiple trees. But ultimately, when you sit down to it, the technology is not going to tell you what you should put into it. It's just going to tell you what's there. And so, yes, there's a very technology-focused component of as the tool. But ultimately, humans still have to make the choices about what goes into it.
Sure.
And so it's very much, in every sense, a human craft-centered process. It just looks different than people are used to.
And so do you have like a traditional blender that's maybe taking what the information the computer says and kind of giving a human element to it, or?
So one of our co-founders is a certified sommelier.
There you go. Okay.
But we don't necessarily invest all of our faith, let's say,
Sure.
In the opinions of a single person. And so we're actually doing a lot of internal tasting panels. We're doing a lot of consumer panels. We want to know what resonates with people. And so we came up with a flavor profile that resonates with what we know is a pretty sizable cohort of the whiskey drinking market. Not everyone. You can't make everyone happy. That's just the nature of art in general. But we came up with something. Ultimately, the choice that we made were driven by what we liked.
And this is one permutation. In theory, you could have infinite varieties, right?
So there's about 2,000 different versions that we came up with before we landed on this. Of course, it's also a regulatory challenge. There's a lot that goes on to ultimately getting to a process like this, especially when TTB has never seen anything like this before. But this is ultimately what we land on for now. And certainly our hope is that down the line, there will be more whiskeys.
All right, well, let's try this.
That's
Cheers.
right.
Thank you for coming out.
Of course.
So I definitely get kind of oak butterscotch notes, some herbal flavors, maybe some orange. Yeah. What was kind of your goal with this? What should I be tasting? That's Nick Drink's untrained palate.
No, I'm sure that you're far more trained than the average consumer. For us, or for me personally, I wanted to emphasize, or I wanted the product to end up be able to emphasize the caramel notes, the vanilla. Definitely some of, as you said, sort of the orange, some of those fruitier notes. We wanted to sort of have an element of spice on it as well, and so you get a little bit of that. But what we didn't want was like the harsh medicinal notes. What we didn't want was like rubber or smoke. Those things have virtue, not necessarily in this format. Ultimately, you can have a little bit of everything, but then each of those things drowns everything else out.
And what's interesting is, so now I've tasted this a couple times. It's hard for me to kind of put this in a bucket.
Sure.
So when I kind of taste it, it lives somewhere in between a malt, a rye, and a bourbon, like somewhere kind of almost like a new category. So I think it's very unique to me. Are you trying to encourage people to mix with it, to drink it neat? What is kind of your goal with the product?
A little bit of both. I mean, there's perhaps some snobbery in, oh, well, that's just a whiskey for mixing because it can't sit on its own. And we definitely want people to be able to enjoy it on its own. I generally prefer it neat versus on the rocks. That's just my preference and my co-founder's preferences as well. But it mixes great into cocktails, and especially a lot of softer, more nuanced notes. So we've done a lot of stuff with like tea and chrysanthemum, and even ginger goes really well with it. Like I said, it's really not that overpowering, and so that's kind of the point. But I think that your framing of it as sort of in the middle of these like three different buckets is really interesting. We've had bartenders be like, it's for me, it's the mix between like a wheated bourbon and a Japanese whiskey, and so the answer to all those things is yes. Like it has elements of all of those things, but the most important takeaway I think is that it isn't in one of those very specific buckets, and so when people drink it expecting that, obviously there's a mismatch, there's misaligned expectations. And so they should go into it being like, this is a fundamentally new category, a new way of thinking about, how whiskey can be expressed.
Now, I feel like the bourbon blogs and groups are very opinionated.
Sure.
They definitely have their favorites and all of that. What would you say to maybe some of the naysayers that would say like, oh, you're just trying to cut corners and like cheat the process? Is there is there almost like a pitch of like for someone to try the product? Because I think it's very unique and I think it deserves to be tasted. What's kind of your pitch to those people?
Look, everyone has their own unique thing that they bring to the table about why they feel that tradition should be preserved is really important. And we're not coming to the table saying that any of those opinions, any of those things is wrong.
Okay.
All we're saying is that sometimes you don't want to watch a Western movie, right? That there's a particular way of thinking about whiskey marketing and branding and history. And that has been pretty well solidified over the last 50 to 100 years. And that doesn't necessarily speak to everyone, right? Some people want new things, different things. And I think that there's, so that I think addresses part of the, why are you bothering to tell a different story? It's just because some people want to hear something different. But I think there's a separate conversation about, are you cutting corners? Are you cheating? I mean, if electronic music is cheating, right, then sure. I mean, we are bypassing certain parts of a process that is otherwise pretty inefficient. Again, there's nothing necessarily inherently bad about the fact that it's inefficient. It's just a different way of thinking about it. And I think what I would come back to is, yes, technology is a really important part. And yes, we can bypass a lot of the slower processes of traditional whiskey making. But the computers can't tell us what we should put in here.
Right.
It's still a very human design process. And in some ways, let me put it this way. Every molecule in there was chosen, not just as whether it should or shouldn't be in there, but the levels should be in there, how they all go together.
Yep.
And so it is every bit a human process that just looks different. And so, if people just don't want to hear that you can do things differently, you know what, we can't make everyone happy.
Right.
But at the end of the day, this isn't a, this isn't a whiskey that has no human story. It's still very much a human loved process. I mean, when people grab a bottle, they'll see on there that it says handmade on it, hand bottled. And I actually had a friend sort of, try to call me out on it recently. He was like, is this really true? I know how you guys make this. So is this true? And yeah, it's literally very, very true. The best example of that is every one of these neck labels has to be individually hand placed on here. And the way that the manufacturer made this label was they don't necessarily stick to itself very well. So someone handles every one of these bottles, hand super glues this down.
Wow.
These labels go on by hand. Everything on here goes by hand. And so there is every bit a human component to the design, the manufacture of this. Yeah, I think that the other important part to add is that we are a pretty small team. We look very different than a traditional spirits company. And one thing that I really wanted was to make sure that everyone had a connection to the product, not just in terms of the marketing and the selling of it, but that they all literally bottled it, that they were on the line, that they saw it happen, that they have their own bottles that went out. And so, like I said, it is different, but it is not, automated and sort of, this isn't AI whiskey. Got it.
Well, thank you so much for coming to Michigan. You threw a great launch party, a lot of fun with Kevin from Castilla and Sfumato. And so that was a great fun. For people who are watching this outside of California or Michigan, how can they get your product?
So we're also in New York.
Okay.
And then, there are a couple of retailers that will ship anywhere in the world.
A lot of them based in New York.
A lot of them based in New York. A lot of them based in San Francisco.
Yep.
We're hoping to launch a few more markets. We're hoping to launch LA and Connecticut, and we might do a little bit in Wisconsin. But honestly, we want to be able to support the markets, right? This is very new. People aren't necessarily sure how to think about it yet. And so we want to be able to launch in markets that we can actually support. So it'll be a little bit slower initially, but for people who are really keen to get their hands on a bottle and aren't in a state that we're serving yet, they can order from certain online retailers.
Perfect. How can people find more about you?
They can visit our website at endlesswest.com. They can also follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Glyph Whiskey or at Endless West.
Great. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you.
If you guys want more Nick Drinks, you can find us at nickdrinks.com. You can find us on Instagram at nickdrinks.com spelled out. And of course, our YouTube channel /nickdrinks. that's it for this episode. Please tune in for more. Till next time. Cheers.
Cheers.